The soft rustle of wrapping paper froze me as I stood in my daughter-in-law's foyer, the same woman who banned me from Christmas. Still, I kept my hand steady on the banister, letting that crinkling sound echo louder than her excuses ever had. As the paper shifted again, its sharp whisper dug into me like every dismissal she'd wrapped in fake politeness. While that same rustle filled the hallway, I realized these weren't my gifts. These were mountains of presents for her parents. The same sound made the truth unmistakable. She never wanted a smaller Christmas. She just wanted it without me. That's when I decided I'd stop begging for space in their home and start building a life where I was never an afterthought. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway of the living room, her hands gripping the edge of the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't from the winter wind that howled outside. It was something colder, something that cut deeper, nestled itself into her bones. Hannah's voice, sharp and deliberate, filled the space between them. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, her eyes not meeting Margaret's. "But this year, it's just family. We're keeping it small." Family. The word hung in the air like a sick joke. Margaret's gaze flicked to James, standing awkwardly by the fireplace, his eyes darting from his wife to his mother, but his mouth remained sealed. He didn't even flinch. This was the same silence he'd offered when Hannah's complaints about Margaret's interference had become a regular fixture in their conversations. The silence that had been an echo of years of half-hearted apologies. The silence that had always felt like a betrayal in itself. Hannah continued, oblivious to the weight of her words. "You know how it is. Olivia needs us to focus on family traditions." As if she wasn't a part of that family. As if Margaret hadn't been the one who had fed James's mouth, soothed his troubled heart, and wiped his tears after every heartbreak. Margaret swallowed back the sharp sting in her throat. "Of course," she said quietly, her voice composed but brittle, as if a gust of wind would break her in half. She turned, her back to them, but not before she saw the faint look of apology flash across Olivia's face. The teenager's eyes were downcast, and she chewed nervously on the edge of her lip, but she didn't say anything. She couldn't. Hannah barely noticed. She was already looking at her phone again, her fingers scrolling with a practiced efficiency. Her posture was the kind of perfect poised stance that Margaret had never quite been able to maintain, no matter how hard she tried. Margaret stepped into the cold silence of the hallway, the sound of the door clicking closed behind her like the final nail in a coffin. It was Christmas Eve. The house was quieter than usual. The echo of the empty rooms seemed to bounce off the walls as she moved, gathering the small things she had prepared for their celebration. The half-decorated tree in the corner, the stack of carefully chosen gifts that she would no longer give. With a sigh, Margaret sank onto the couch, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The Christmas lights from the neighbor's house filtered in through the window, a warm glow against the snow. The faint smell of cookies drifted from the kitchen, but Margaret had no appetite for them. No appetite for anything. Her phone buzzed in her lap. It was a photo of James, Hannah, and Olivia, smiling at the dinner table, an untouched plate of food sitting in front of them. The caption read, "Merry Christmas from our family to yours." Margaret stared at it, her eyes stinging. The warmth of their smiles mocked her. She had once been a part of that family, the center of it. But now, it was as though she'd never existed. She swiped the notification away and tossed the phone onto the coffee table, the metallic clink of it sounding too loud in the quiet room. She leaned back and closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, but it was hard. The weight of the years spent quietly in the background, the years when her efforts had been met with dismissal or indifference, seemed to settle over her like a blanket of cold. Every Christmas had been the same. She had poured her love and care into this family, only to have it ignored, rejected. But this was different. She would not let them do this to her. Not this time. Her thoughts drifted to Olivia's quiet apology, the unspoken words hanging between them like a thread. The girl had tried, even if her hands were tied. Margaret wished she could somehow protect her from this, but Olivia would have to find her own way out of this tangled web. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself lost in memories. The first Christmas she had spent with James and Hannah, when their house had been small but filled with laughter. She had always been the one to host, the one who made sure everything was perfect. She remembered how, when Olivia was born, she had made that ridiculous little quilt with the baby's name stitched in the corner. She thought of how proud she had been, how she had wanted to hold her family close, keep them together, make every holiday memorable. Now it felt like nothing more than a distant dream. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. No matter how many times she told herself she had enough, that she had gotten used to the rejection, it still hurt. Then, a soft knock on the door broke the stillness. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and stood up, surprised at the sound. Her heart gave a jolt, half expecting it to be Olivia. But it wasn't. It was Ruth, standing there in the doorway, her coat dusted with snow, a sympathetic smile on her face. "Got room for one more Christmas guest?" Ruth asked, her voice warm and welcoming. Margaret nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek despite herself. The ache of the day was still there, but in that moment she felt a spark of something else, something like hope. "I'm not sure how much Christmas spirit I've got left," Margaret said, her voice thick. "You don't need spirit," Ruth replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "You need company, and I'm here for that." Margaret smiled faintly. Maybe it wasn't over after all. The tree sat untouched in the corner of Margaret's living room. It had been up for days, the ornaments hanging like dull memories, the lights blinking faintly, as though even the decorations knew they were unwanted. Margaret had once prided herself on creating the perfect holiday atmosphere, but this year there was no joy to weave into the festivities, no laughter to echo in the hallways. She stood in the middle of the living room, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, staring at the pile of carefully wrapped gifts on the coffee table. She'd spent weeks picking out presents, thoughtful things for each of them, chosen with love and a belief that somehow this Christmas would be different. But now, those gifts felt like burdens, gifts that wouldn't be opened, not with the way things had turned out. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. She wasn't going to give them anything this year. She wouldn't give them her time, her love, or her energy anymore. Not after the way Hannah had dismissed her so easily, as though she were some peripheral member of the family, something to be cast aside for the sake of appearances. She walked to the corner of the room and began unwrapping the gifts she had bought. One by one, she slid the colorful paper off and stacked the presents neatly, ignoring the growing ache in her chest. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of it all, of what she had lost, of the family she thought she knew. This wasn't how Christmas was supposed to feel. It wasn't supposed to feel like defeat. And yet, that's exactly what it did. The doorbell rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Margaret glanced toward the window. It was dusk now, and the lights on the neighboring houses glittered like small, distant stars. She wasn't expecting anyone, but her heart gave a small leap anyway. Maybe it was Ruth again, coming to offer some comfort. But when she opened the door, it was not Ruth. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, with a small, brightly colored gift bag in her hands. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "I thought you might like something sweet this holiday." Margaret blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected anyone to remember her. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison," she replied, her voice a little too thick. The woman handed her the bag, But as Margaret took it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the gesture, though kind, was hollow. It was just one more gift she didn't know how to accept. She wasn't part of a family anymore. She wasn't part of anything anymore. Mrs. Ellison didn't stay long, not even long enough for Margaret to thank her properly. As the door closed behind her, Margaret set the gift bag down on the table with the others. It felt like an afterthought, just like the presents she had so carefully chosen for her son and daughter-in-law. A token, a reminder that what had once been meaningful now just felt empty. She sank into her armchair, and the quiet of the house wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. The sound of a phone buzzing on the coffee table broke the stillness. She glanced down at it. Hannah's Christmas photos. There they were again. James, Olivia, and Hannah, all perfectly posed around a lavish dinner table. The caption under the photo read, "Family is everything." Margaret felt the words press into her chest like an unbearable weight. Family? Was she still part of theirs? Or had they already forgotten she existed? Her fingers hovered over the phone for a moment, but she didn't open the app. Instead, she slid the phone to the side and reached for her journal, the one she'd bought after the incident, to record her thoughts. There had been a time when she would have shared her feelings with them, James, Hannah, Olivia. But now, the only place she could find peace was in the pages of her own private refuge. The pen scratched across the paper, the words flowing more easily than she'd anticipated. "I don't know what I did to deserve this." She paused, rereading the line. Did it even matter? Would they care? Would they ever see what they'd done to her? She felt the tears welling again, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she continued to write, her emotions pouring out in jagged fragments. "This is the last Christmas I'll spend like this. I won't keep pretending." The words echoed in her mind as she scribbled them down. She sat in the silence, letting the stillness of the room wrap itself around her. Christmas Eve had always been a time of warmth, laughter, and family. But now it felt like a stark reminder of how hollow everything had become. As the clock ticked on and the night deepened, Margaret's thoughts drifted once more to Olivia. The girl had been the one to apologize, the only one to even acknowledge what had happened. Her face, full of unspoken words, haunted Margaret. She wished she could take the pain away from her, wished she could shield her from the same heartbreak Margaret had felt all these years. But what could she do? She couldn't fix what had been broken. Not now, and not without consequences. The phone buzzed again, a reminder of the life she was no longer part of. She picked it up reluctantly, her eyes still fixed on the screen. This time it was a message from Ruth. "I'm bringing over dinner. You shouldn't be alone tonight. Let me take care of you." Margaret read the message, then set the phone down without replying. Maybe Ruth was right. Maybe tonight she didn't have to be alone, but the ache inside her wouldn't go away. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if she ever would feel truly whole again. The dusty box sat on the floor beside Margaret's feet, its contents a reminder of things long forgotten. She had been avoiding it for months, maybe longer, but now, as the evening stretched on and the quiet of the house seemed to press in on her, she found herself reaching for it. The box of family photos, letters, and memories that had once felt like pieces of a puzzle she had gladly put together. But tonight, they felt different. Her fingers brushed the edges of the old photographs, their corners curling, the colors faded by time. A younger Margaret smiled up at her, holding baby James in her arms, the joy of new motherhood still fresh in her eyes. She paused, staring at the photograph for a long moment. James had been her everything, her reason for waking up every day, her world. But now, she felt so far away from him. Shifting the photographs aside, Margaret's hands moved to the stack of yellowed letters at the bottom of the box. Most were from friends and relatives, some from her late husband, Arthur. Her heart stilled as her fingers brushed against a familiar envelope, its edges worn, the paper fragile but unmistakable. The handwriting was Arthur's. Her pulse quickened as she pulled the letter free, the weight of it thick with memories. She could still hear his voice in her mind, his steady, calming presence. Yet, as she unfolded the letter, a shiver ran down her spine. The letter was dated just a few months before Arthur's sudden death, and the words on the page were not what she expected. She read them aloud under her breath, her voice quiet in the empty room. Margaret, there are things you don't know, things about Hannah and her parents. I can't explain everything now, but I need you to be cautious. I've seen the way they've manipulated you, how they've quietly undermined your role in this family. It's been happening for years, and it's time you see it for what it is. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the letter again, the words sinking in like stones thrown into a deep lake. What did this mean? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the cryptic warning. She had always felt the cool distance between her and Hannah's family, but this was something darker, something much more deliberate. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the letter crumpling in her hands as she thought about the years of subtle discontent, the quiet judgments at family gatherings, the way Hannah's parents had always kept a careful distance, their cold smiles never quite reaching their eyes. She had dismissed it all as normal family dynamics, nothing to worry about. But Arthur had known. He had seen it. And now she saw it too. Ruth's knock at the door startled her, the familiar sound a small comfort in the chaos of her mind. Margaret quickly hid the letter in her lap, trying to gather herself before opening the door. Ruth stepped in, her face soft with concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. Margaret smiled faintly, her thoughts still heavy with the letter. "I'm getting there." Ruth gave her a knowing look and settled into the chair across from her. "I brought you some tea," she said, her voice steady, offering comfort without asking too many questions. She set the teapot down on the table, the aroma of chamomile filling the room. "I was going through some things," Margaret said, her voice quieter now. "And I found something. A letter from Arthur." She handed the letter to Ruth, who took it in her hands with reverence. Ruth's brow furrowed as she read, her face unreadable. She looked up at Margaret after a long moment. "He knew," Ruth murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. He knew something was wrong. He knew about Hannah's parents, about the way they've been pulling strings behind the scenes. I've always felt like an outsider, but I thought it was just me being sensitive. Now I know it wasn't just me. They've been undermining me all these years." Ruth leaned back in her chair, setting the letter down gently on the table. "You've been dealing with this for so long, Margaret. It's no wonder you feel the way you do." The weight of Ruth's words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret swallowed hard, a bitter taste in her mouth. She had spent years trying to fit into a mold that never quite fit, trying to force herself to be what they wanted her to be. But now, with the truth before her, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't the weak, invisible woman she had been led to believe she was. She was strong, capable, and more than capable of taking back control of her own life. "I won't let them do this anymore," Margaret said, her voice firm for the first time in weeks. "I've put up with it for far too long, but I'm done. I'm going to take control, Ruth. I'm going to make sure my family knows the truth." Ruth smiled, her eyes soft but proud. "I knew you'd get there. You've always had the strength, Margaret. It just took you a while to see it." Margaret's heart fluttered with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. This was just the beginning. The truth was out there now, and she was ready to confront it, to take back everything she had lost. But as Ruth left that night, the quiet weight of what was to come settled heavily on Margaret's shoulders. What would she do with this newfound power? What steps would she take to reclaim her life? The letter, once hidden away, now felt like a spark that would ignite a fire. Margaret knew there was no going back. The journey she had begun, the path toward redemption, had only just begun. And as she stared at the flickering lights of her tree, she knew one thing for certain. The narrative was hers to write now. The kitchen hummed with the comforting rhythm of clinking pots and sizzling pans. Margaret moved through the familiar motions, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and set the table. The smell of roasted turkey, garlic mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce filled the house, a reminder of all the Christmas dinners she had lovingly prepared for her family over the years. This year, it was different. This Christmas, Margaret wasn't cooking for the people who had dismissed her, for the family that had failed her. She was cooking for herself, and, perhaps, for those who still knew her worth. Arthur's favorite dishes were scattered across the counter, his famous stuffing, the buttery green beans, the pies that always brought him a little too much joy. She had thought about making something simpler, something quick, but then she realized this was her moment. She had to do it right. She owed it to herself. With every dish, she felt a small knot of grief unravel. It was a bittersweet act, preparing a meal that had once been a shared joy. But now it was a declaration, a statement that she would no longer be silenced. She would take back what was rightfully hers. She would no longer be an afterthought in her family's narrative. As she set the table with the same care she'd always used for Christmas dinners, a small thought tugged at her. Would Olivia come? The girl had been quiet during their last conversation, but she'd seemed so regretful. The ache in Margaret's heart was heavy, but she couldn't wait forever. She had to move on. The doorbell rang, and Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel before heading to the door. Her heart skipped when she opened it. Olivia stood there, her arms full of a large, carefully wrapped gift. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," she said quietly, her face flushed from the cold. Margaret blinked, surprised but not surprised. She had suspected, but seeing Olivia here made it real. The girl had a quiet determination about her, something Margaret had always admired, even when things had been strained between them. "I wasn't sure if you'd want company," Olivia said hesitantly, holding out the gift. Margaret smiled softly, a warmth blooming inside her chest that she hadn't expected. "Of course I do," she replied, her voice steady. "You're always welcome here." Olivia stepped inside, looking around at the set table, the flickering candles casting a soft glow over the room. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like Christmas was supposed to feel: comfortable, warm, and full of promise. They didn't speak much as Margaret finished setting the table, but Olivia helped without being asked, placing the plates and glasses just so, arranging the silverware with quiet precision. There was a gentleness to Olivia now, a grace that Margaret hadn't noticed before. The past wasn't forgotten, but there was a softening between them, like the first hint of dawn breaking through the dark night. When they finally sat down to eat, it was just the two of them. No distractions, no awkward silences, just a shared meal, a quiet understanding between grandmother and granddaughter. Margaret reached for her phone during the meal, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. There was a message from James. "Mom, please reconsider. We miss you. It's not the same without you here." For a moment, Margaret was tempted to respond. The familiar ache in her chest twisted, and she could almost hear his voice, his pleading tone, the one that always tried to smooth over the mess, the one that never truly fixed anything. She thought of the years of silences between them, the moments when he had stood by and watched Hannah's cold treatment, too afraid to stand up for her. With a steady hand, she typed her response, each word carrying the weight of everything she had learned in the past few days. "I'll be just fine without them." She hit send and set the phone down, the words hanging in the air like an echo. Margaret didn't look back at it, her eyes instead meeting Olivia's, who gave her a small but knowing smile. The rest of the meal passed in a peaceful silence. The food, the flickering candlelight, and the quiet comfort of each other's presence made the pain of the past few days feel distant, like a shadow that had finally begun to recede. After dinner, Ruth arrived, as promised, bringing with her a fresh batch of Christmas cookies and a bottle of wine. Her warm laugh and easy conversation filled the room, and for a moment, Margaret felt as if the world outside had disappeared. There was no judgment here, no cold dismissals, just genuine companionship. Ruth handed Margaret a glass of wine, her eyes bright. "You did this," she said softly. "You took control of your story." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into her chest. She hadn't just made dinner that night. She had reclaimed her place in the world. For so long, she had felt like a background character in her own life. But now, she was the one who held the pen. She was the one who chose the ending. As Ruth and Olivia laughed together, talking about old Christmas traditions and what the new year might bring, Margaret took a deep breath and let it all sink in. She was free. Free from the bitterness, from the hurt, from the idea that she wasn't enough. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. But as the night drew to a close, a lingering thought crept into her mind. This was only the beginning. Margaret had claimed Christmas for herself, but there was more to come, so much more, and no one could take that away from her. The journey ahead was hers to walk. Margaret sat across from Diana, her estate attorney, in the small, immaculate office, the quiet hum of the overhead lights filling the space. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders, but it wasn't the burden of uncertainty. No, it was the sense of finality, the feeling that once this path was set, there was no going back. Diana's office was a reflection of the woman herself. Clean, precise, with sharp edges softened by delicate touches. An arrangement of flowers on the desk, a stack of leather-bound books on the shelf. Diana sat across from her, her pencil poised over the papers. The woman was efficient, but there was warmth behind her professionalism. She'd been with Margaret through thick and thin, helping her with legal matters when Arthur had passed, offering advice when things with James and Hannah had soured. Today, however, the task ahead felt monumental. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" Diana's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You've given a lot to your family over the years. Taking them out of your will, it could cause some friction." Margaret took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the paperwork before her. Her mind raced, but her heart was certain. The decision felt right, even as the consequences began to settle in. "I'm sure," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady. "I've spent too many years sacrificing for people who never truly appreciated me. My family, they've hurt me more than they know, and I've taken it for far too long. It's time I take control." Diana nodded slowly, her sharp eyes studying Margaret's face. She didn't push further. She knew Margaret well enough to understand that this wasn't a decision made on a whim. It was calculated, necessary. With a steady hand, Margaret signed the papers, the ink leaving its mark as if to seal her fate. "I'm removing James and Hannah from significant parts of my estate," Margaret said, her voice firm, a thread of finality in her words. "They've made it clear that family doesn't mean much to them. I won't reward their betrayal." Diana didn't flinch. "And Olivia?" Margaret smiled softly, a deep warmth blooming in her chest. "Olivia gets a trust, everything I can give her. She deserves a future free from the turmoil, the lies, the cold distance of her parents. I want her to know that she has a choice, that someone believes in her." Diana made a note on the papers, her pen scratching across the surface. "I'll make sure it's watertight." "But Margaret, you know there's a chance this will be contested, right? If Hannah challenges the will, it could get messy." Margaret met Diana's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Let her challenge it. I've been their pawn long enough. If they want to fight, they'll have to face me. I won't back down anymore." Diana's lips curled into a small smile, a rare flicker of approval. "You've made your decision. It's not an easy one, but it's yours." Margaret nodded, feeling a quiet strength grow within her. The old Margaret, the one who had always kept the peace, the one who had swallowed her hurt for the sake of family, was no more. She had taken back her voice, and with it, her power. The papers were signed, the arrangements made. Margaret stood, pushing the chair back with a quiet finality. It was time to move forward. But there was more to do. Much more. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Margaret had started donating some of the family heirlooms, items that had once held so much meaning for her, but now felt like chains. The antique silverware, the china that had been passed down for generations, the fine crystal glasses that had gathered dust in the cabinets. Each item was carefully wrapped and sent off to those who would cherish it. To people who saw value in what it really was, not just in what it symbolized. It wasn't easy, parting with things that had been a part of her life for so long, but each donation felt like shedding a layer of herself that had been tied to the past, to a family that had never really understood her. One afternoon, Margaret sat in the quiet of her living room, surrounded by the remnants of her former life. Old pictures, letters, objects that told stories of a time she would no longer let define her. The phone on the coffee table buzzed, breaking the silence. She reached for it, already knowing who it would be. It was James. "Mom, I don't understand. What are you doing? We're still family. I can't believe you'd do this." The words felt like a punch to the gut, but Margaret remained calm. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard as she typed her response, each word deliberate. "You may be family, James, but you stopped acting like it a long time ago. I can't keep pretending." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the words sinking in. There was a strange sense of peace in this moment, in reclaiming what was hers, in setting boundaries that had never existed before. But the fight was far from over. Margaret knew that confronting Hannah, confronting the lies, was inevitable. There would be battles ahead, and perhaps even more losses, but she had taken the first step. And now, for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. The hope that perhaps this time, she would win. Her legacy, rewritten. The days had stretched on, each one passing in a quiet, peaceful rhythm. Margaret had settled into a routine, a life she was slowly learning to savor. The silence that had once been an unwelcome companion had now become a kind of comfort, a space where she could breathe freely, unburdened by the weight of her family's expectations. She had spent time with Ruth and her closest friends, savoring the joy of real, unguarded conversations. They were the ones who made her feel seen, heard, and, most importantly, respected. But then the message came. It was from Hannah. "Mom, I think it's time we put all of this behind us. Let's sit down and have a proper dinner. It's Christmas. We should be a family." The words felt like an offer wrapped in an apology, but there was something hollow about it, something that made Margaret's stomach turn. After weeks of silence, after everything that had happened, Hannah's message seemed too late, too convenient. Margaret stared at the phone screen, her fingers lingering above the keyboard. She could almost hear the sweetened tone of Hannah's voice in her mind, hear the rehearsed sincerity that was always so expertly crafted. But Margaret wasn't fooled. Not anymore. She took a deep breath, setting the phone down gently. She wasn't going to fall for this again. She wasn't going to play the role of the forgiving mother, the one who always caved for the sake of keeping the peace. No, this time, she had something different in mind. Margaret composed her reply, each word firm and deliberate. "Thank you for the invitation, Hannah. But I'm doing just fine on my own. I'm in a good place, and I don't need to revisit the past to move forward. I wish you and the family well." She hit send, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. The message had been simple, and yet, it carried more weight than any dinner invitation could ever have. She was reclaiming her boundaries, her life, and her peace. The days that followed were peaceful. Margaret had no intention of spending another Christmas trying to repair something that had already been broken. She planned a small holiday gathering, just Ruth and a few close friends who had become her chosen family. They would share good food, laughter, and the kind of easy companionship that Margaret had come to treasure. The night of the gathering arrived, and Margaret found herself in the kitchen once more, preparing the meal with a quiet joy. The aromas of roasted ham, fresh bread, and spiced cider filled the air. As she moved about the kitchen, there was a sense of satisfaction in the simple act of cooking for those who truly appreciated her, who didn't see her as a source of obligation, but as a person. Just as the table was set and the first round of drinks was poured, the doorbell rang. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel, wondering who could be arriving this early. As she opened the door, her heart skipped a beat. It was Olivia. The girl stood on the doorstep, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes wide and uncertain. In her arms was a small gift, wrapped in paper with a bright red bow. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," Olivia said softly, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation, but also a quiet determination. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, something warm and genuine. She stepped back, ushering Olivia inside, and took the gift from her hands. "I wasn't sure if you were still having your dinner," Olivia said, her gaze flickering around the room at the set table, the soft glow of the candles. "But I wanted to be here. I didn't want you to be alone." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "You're always welcome here, Olivia," she said, her voice thick with affection. "Come in, stay. This is your Christmas too." They didn't need to say much. Olivia settled in with the others, her presence bringing a lightness to the room. Margaret could see the love in the way Olivia moved, how she helped Ruth with the wine glasses, how she lingered at the stove to offer help with the ham, and how her laughter blended seamlessly with the chatter of their close-knit gathering. It was a kind of peace Margaret had missed, the kind that felt natural and uncomplicated. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself reflecting on just how far she had come. She had been so afraid of losing the people she loved, of fighting for what was rightfully hers. But now, with Olivia by her side and Ruth's steady friendship grounding her, Margaret realized that sometimes letting go was the only way to truly move forward. Just as they were finishing dessert, Margaret's phone buzzed again. It was a message from James. "Mom, we miss you. Can't we just talk about this? It's Christmas. Please, come back." Margaret stared at the screen, her fingers lingering over the keys. For a moment, the ache in her chest tightened. She thought about James, about the years they had spent together, about the man who had once been her son. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone who didn't know how to stand up for her, someone who hadn't shown her the respect she deserved. She typed her replies slowly, the words clear and final. "I'm not coming back, James. I'm done trying to fix something that's been broken for too long. This is the life I've chosen now, and it's the one I deserve." She hit send. As she put the phone down, she looked around the table, meeting the eyes of Ruth, of Olivia, of the friends who had chosen her. A smile tugged at her lips, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her future was hers to shape, and no one, No one could take that from her. But as she glanced at the phone one last time, she couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when Hannah and James found out she wasn't coming back? Margaret sat at her small desk by the window, the soft light of the lamp casting a golden glow on the pages in front of her. Her journal lay open, its blank pages inviting the weight of the words she had been carrying for so long. She had written in journals before, scribbled down her thoughts in the quiet of the night, her feelings a jumble of hurt and confusion. But this was different. This time, it was her story she was telling, and it would be the truth, raw and unapologetic. The pen hovered in her hand for a moment. Then she wrote, December 25th, 2025. Today, I realize that the love I gave was never enough for them. I have always been the afterthought, the one who waited in the wings while they built their perfect life. But I am no longer waiting. This time, I am speaking the truth, and I will not be silenced. Margaret paused, the weight of her own words sinking in. She had spent too many years trying to maintain the peace, trying to be the good mother, the good mother-in-law. But what had it gotten her? Rejection, distance, betrayal. She had been dismissed, minimized, and now she was reclaiming her voice. She turned the page and began writing again. But this time, the words flowed faster, as if something deep inside her had been waiting for the right moment to break free. For too long, I've kept quiet about the way my family treated me, the way my son James allowed his wife, Hannah, to undermine me at every turn. They dismissed my presence, my love, and my attempts to be a part of their lives. They had their picture-perfect holiday celebrations while I was left on the outside. And the worst part? I let them. I let myself believe I wasn't worth fighting for. Margaret stopped for a moment, her hand shaking slightly as she put the pen down. The emotions she had been suppressing for so long were flooding to the surface, but this time, she was allowing them to flow. She wasn't hiding anymore. She looked at her phone on the desk, the notification light flashing. It was time. She had spent enough of her life hiding from the truth, both her own and theirs. Margaret opened a new tab on her laptop, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. She had never shared her story publicly before, but today felt different. Today, she would expose it all, for anyone who needed to hear it. She started a blog. The Truth Behind Christmas. It felt fitting, almost like an act of defiance. A way of telling the world what she had endured and what she had finally learned. Her first post was a simple introduction. I've spent too many years trying to make my family happy, too many Christmases pretending everything was fine when it was far from it. This is the truth about my family, about the betrayal, the silence, and the love that was never enough. She hesitated for only a moment before hitting publish. It was out there now, a piece of her life laid bare for anyone to read. She sat back, staring at the screen, the weight of the words still hanging in the air. The blog didn't go unnoticed. Within hours, Margaret had her first comment. Then another, and another. Thank you for sharing this. I thought I was the only one. My family did the same to me. This resonates so deeply. I've been through something similar, and reading your words makes me feel less alone. The comments began pouring in, each one a small thread of connection, a tiny flicker of light in the dark. She wasn't alone anymore. She had never been alone. Her story wasn't just hers. It was the story of so many others who had been cast aside, dismissed, and made to feel invisible. Then, 2 days later, the phone rang. Margaret knew who it was before she even picked it up. Hannah, she said, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet resolve. What is it? I saw your blog. Hannah's voice was tight, controlled, but there was a sharp edge to it. How dare you air our dirty laundry like that? Why would you do this? We're family. Margaret's heart didn't race. There was no fear now. Just the quiet understanding that she was finally standing her ground. "I'm telling my story, Hannah," Margaret replied, her tone calm. "The truth has been silenced for too long, and I'm not sorry for sharing it." Hannah's voice was rising now, her frustration clear. "You've always been dramatic, Margaret. You've always made everything about you. But this is too much. You're ruining everything." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened, but she refused to let her emotions get the better of her. "I'm not ruining anything. I'm exposing the truth. You've built your life on lies, and I won't let you hide behind them anymore." There was a long pause on the other end, and then Hannah spoke, her voice low and simmering with anger. "You'll regret this. You've made a public spectacle of yourself. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." Margaret exhaled slowly, the words no longer holding the sting they once had. "Do what you need to do. I'm done letting you control the narrative. The truth is out, and I won't apologize for it." She hung up without another word. Margaret stared at the phone, her chest tight, but her resolve stronger than ever. Hannah would not silence her again. The blog, the truth. It was her story to tell now. And as the comments continued to come in, Margaret felt the beginnings of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Empowerment. This was just the beginning. There would be more battles ahead, more challenges. But Margaret was ready. For the first time in years, she was no longer hiding, and no one, not even her own family, could take that from her. The local community hall was buzzing with activity as Margaret stepped through the doors, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd been invited to speak at a local event. Her voice had always been strong, always ready to guide and nurture others. But this was different. This was her story. This was about the years of silence, the betrayal, and the strength it had taken to break free. She paused at the entrance, taking in the room. It was full of familiar faces, neighbors, acquaintances from church, and strangers who had come to hear the stories of people who had survived the pain of family estrangement. It was a strange mixture of emotions, nerves, anticipation, and an overwhelming sense of clarity. She wasn't just here to speak, she was here to empower. The event organizer, a woman in her late 40s with a warm smile, came over to greet her. "Margaret, we're so happy to have you here," she said, guiding Margaret toward the stage. "Your story is exactly what so many people need to hear. I know it's going to resonate with everyone in this room." Margaret nodded, her hands steady but her thoughts racing. She had read and reread her speech, and now, standing at the edge of the stage, she felt ready. The words had already formed in her heart. This wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration. The event organizer handed Margaret a microphone and whispered, "Whenever you're ready." Margaret took a deep breath, walked to the podium, and looked out at the crowd. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her. But there was no fear now, only the quiet power of knowing who she was. She began speaking slowly, her voice resonant and firm. "I spent too many years being quiet. I spent years trying to be the good mother, the good wife, the good mother-in-law. I played the part of the forgiving one, the one who made excuses, the one who always put others first." She paused, letting her words settle. "But at what cost?" she continued. "For too long, I kept silent while the people I loved treated me as though I was invisible. I was the one who was never invited to the table. I was the one who was told to stay away when things didn't fit their narrative. I was the one who believed love would fix everything. But love, without respect, is just a tether that binds you in chains." She felt the words surge forward, each one more freeing than the last. "I am here today to say, I am done hiding. I am done being the afterthought. And I'm here to tell you all, if you are suffering the same way, you are not alone. You don't have to be quiet anymore. You don't have to shrink for the comfort of others." The room was silent, but Margaret could feel the ripple of energy, something between a hush and a collective breath being held. She continued, "Family can be the most beautiful thing, but when it becomes a tool for manipulation, when it becomes a weapon, it loses its value. I've had to learn that the hard way. But here's the thing, when you choose yourself, when you stand up for your own worth, you change the narrative, you take your power back, and that is the most liberating thing I've ever done." Margaret's gaze swept the room, her heart steady, her pulse calm. She had never spoken like this before, never laid her soul bare for others to see, but she felt no regret, no hesitation. The silence had been broken, the truth spoken aloud. She finished her speech with a quiet, confident smile. "I am not a victim of my family's choices anymore. I am the author of my own life, and I will no longer allow anyone to define my worth." The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a celebration of her courage, her strength. And in that moment, Margaret realized something she hadn't known before. She had a voice, and it was powerful. As the applause died down, Margaret stepped down from the stage and was greeted by a flood of people who wanted to talk to her, thank her, share their own stories of estrangement. But there was one face in the crowd that caught her eye: Olivia, standing near the back of the room, her eyes bright with pride. Margaret's heart surged, a quiet warmth filling her chest as she met her granddaughter's gaze. Olivia didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The unspoken bond between them was enough. Olivia's presence in that moment was a testament to everything Margaret had fought for. As the event continued, Margaret's phone buzzed with a new message. She checked it, recognizing the familiar number. It was James. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for what you did today. I've been thinking about everything, and I want to try again. Can we talk soon?" Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. She felt the familiar tug of old emotions: hope, regret, the constant ache of wanting things to be different. But something in her knew. She wasn't ready to open that door again. Not yet. She put the phone down, letting out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She had taken her stand, told her story, and stepped into the light. She wasn't going back. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself at peace. She had confronted her family's betrayal, and now she was building something new, something real. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. But the thought of James's message lingered, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. There were still choices to be made, still questions to answer. And for the first time in years, Margaret was ready to face them. The room was filled with a soft hum of activity as Margaret stood before the bell. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, but today it felt different. The walls seemed less oppressive, the fluorescent lights overhead less glaring. She glanced around at the nurses, the patients, some of them still in their gowns, others standing nervously near the exit, waiting for their treatments to end. Margaret took a steadying breath, the coolness of the moment settling over her as she reached for the bell. It was small, just a simple brass bell, attached to the wall near the nurses' station, but it symbolized something monumental, a victory she had earned after months of grueling treatments, a symbol of survival. She grasped the bell's handle, her fingers slightly trembling, and gave it a firm ring. The sound echoed in the sterile room, ringing out like a call to everyone in the clinic that she had made it. "Congratulations, Margaret," a nurse said, her voice warm, her smile genuine. She clapped softly, and a few others in the room joined in, offering tentative applause. It wasn't a grand celebration, but it didn't need to be. For Margaret, this moment was enough. But as the bell's final echo faded, a familiar ache settled into her chest. She turned toward the door, expecting to see a familiar face, Someone from her family, perhaps James, perhaps Olivia, but the only people there were the nurses, the strangers. She had told them all. She had made sure they knew when her final treatment would be, hoping that someone, anyone, would show up. But no one did. The lump in her throat grew heavier as she swallowed back the hurt. The disappointment, though familiar, was still sharp. James hadn't come. Neither had Hannah. It stung in ways she had come to expect, but this time, the sting cut deeper. She had fought for her family, for years. She had held her tongue, waited for the reconciliation that would never come. But today, she was done waiting. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye, but Margaret wiped it away quickly, pulling herself together. She wasn't going to let this moment of triumph be overshadowed by the absence of those who should have been there. She walked out of the treatment room with her head held high, the weight of the past few months slowly lifting off her shoulders. The hallways, once filled with uncertainty, now seemed brighter. She had done it. She had conquered cancer, and in doing so, she had reclaimed a part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the trees outside her home, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the card in her hands. It was a simple card, hand-drawn with love. Olivia had sent it. The words inside were written in the neat handwriting of a teenager, but they carried a depth of emotion that made Margaret's heart ache. "You beat it, but you were always stronger than it." The words wrapped around her like a blanket, offering warmth and comfort where none had been before. Olivia understood. Olivia was the only one who understood. The only one who had always seen her, despite the rest of the family's blindness. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the card's sentiment to settle deep within her chest. Olivia had become her rock, the one person who had never turned away, who had never doubted her strength, even when Margaret had doubted it herself. She set the card down on the table and picked up her phone. It was time to make some changes. Her will had been revised before, but after the treatment, after everything she had been through, it felt like it needed another revision. One more final act of taking control of her life. She opened the will document, scrolling through the clauses. After a long pause, she added a line at the end, her pen moving quickly across the paper. "No family member, including but not limited to James Clark or Hannah Roberts, shall be notified of my death or be entitled to any part of my estate. Any and all assets shall be directed to a trust for Olivia Clark and charity organizations supporting women overcoming family estrangement and cancer recovery." The words were clean, final. There was no hesitation now. She had been silent for too long, her voice drowned out by the demands and expectations of a family that had never truly seen her. But now she was in control. She was the one who decided. She set the pen down, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with the choices she had made. Later that evening, Ruth came over, bringing a bottle of wine to mark the occasion. Margaret smiled at her, thankful for the quiet comfort that only true friends could provide. "Congratulations," Ruth said, raising her glass. "You did it. Both with your health and with your life. You've finally taken back what's been yours all along." Margaret nodded, her smile small but genuine. She knew Ruth was right. This wasn't just about surviving cancer. This was about survival in every sense. Surviving the betrayal, the years of silence, and the quiet erasure. And now, she was finally living her truth. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder of the life she had left behind. It was James. "I heard you rang the bell today. I'm proud of you. Maybe we can start fresh. I'd really like that." Margaret stared at the message, her heart tight with mixed emotions. She had come so far from the woman who would have rushed to forgive, to heal the family fractures. But that woman was gone. She set the phone down, a calm resolve filling her chest. The answer to James's message was clear, but she wasn't ready to send it yet. Not today. For now, she simply raised her glass to Ruth and to the future, because no one would ever take her power away again. And that was worth celebrating. The letter from Amber had arrived unexpectedly, its cold, sharp tone cutting through the quiet afternoon. Margaret hadn't been prepared for it. The words on the page, cease and desist, had leapt off the paper, demanding her attention. Amber, in her righteous indignation, was attempting to silence Margaret, to erase her voice, just as she had tried to do in the past. Margaret had always known this day might come. She had written her blog, told her story, fully aware that it could spark a reaction from the very people who had caused her so much pain. But this letter, demanding she retract her words, stop exposing the family's lies, was the final, desperate attempt to control her once again. She set the letter aside, feeling the sharp sting of anger rise in her chest. There was no way in hell she was going to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The next day, Margaret sat across from Diana, her estate attorney, in the same small office where they had finalized her will months ago. Diana had handled every legal detail for Margaret's estate with precision, but today was different. The battle had shifted. The confrontation was no longer just about money or inheritance. It was about silence, about whether Margaret would be silenced. Diana read through the letter, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed its contents. "They're trying to intimidate you," Diana said, her voice measured but firm. "This is nothing more than an attempt to bully you into silence." Margaret nodded. She wasn't surprised by the tactic, but the anger still burned inside her. The fact that Hannah and Amber, who had been the architects of so much of her family's estrangement, thought they could undo her hard-earned peace with a letter felt like a slap in the face. "They think they can make me shut up," Margaret said quietly, her hands clenched on the table. "But they're wrong." Diana met her eyes, her gaze strong and unwavering. "We'll fight this, but the decision is yours. You can either cave, or you can stand firm and let the world hear what they've done." Margaret didn't hesitate. She had already made up her mind. "I'm not backing down. I'll post the letter. Every word of it. Let the world see the kind of people they really are." Diana raised an eyebrow, impressed by Margaret's resolve. "It's a bold move. Are you sure?" Margaret's answer was already clear in her mind. She nodded. "Yes, I'm done hiding. The truth is the truth, no matter how much they try to bury it." The next day, Margaret sat at her desk, the familiar hum of her laptop filling the space. Her fingers moved quickly over the keys as she crafted a blog post, one that would expose the letter in its entirety, redacting only personal details to protect herself. She published the post with a steady hand, knowing that once it was out there would be no taking it back. The response was immediate. Within hours, her blog post had gone viral. Comments poured in from readers, sharing their own stories of estrangement, betrayal, and the toxic dynamics that had shattered their families. Many of them were cancer survivors, like Margaret, who had faced not only the physical battles of illness, but the emotional wounds inflicted by those who should have loved them the most. The blog post gained traction beyond the expected. It wasn't just a personal story anymore. It was a movement. It became a voice for the voiceless, those who had suffered in silence for far too long. "I'm crying reading this," one comment read. "You've put into words everything I've been too afraid to say about my own family. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone." Margaret felt a swelling in her chest, a mixture of pride and relief. This was what she had been waiting for. This was the moment she had needed to reclaim everything she had lost. A few days later, as the blog post continued to gain momentum, a knock on her door interrupted the silence. She opened it to find Olivia standing there, holding a bouquet of fresh flowers. Her face was flushed with the cold, but her eyes were warm, and there was a quiet determination in her stance. "Grandma," Olivia said softly, stepping inside, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. I saw the post, and I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been my hero, but today, I see you as even stronger than I ever thought possible." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She reached out, pulling Olivia into a tight embrace. "You've always been my strength, Olivia. You're the reason I kept going." Olivia pulled back, handing Margaret the bouquet. "I'm so proud of you. You've changed everything, for both of us." The two of them stood there for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. It wasn't just the flowers, or the words, that had touched Margaret. It was the depth of their connection, the silent bond that had always been there, even when the rest of her family had turned away. Later that evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, reading the flood of messages that had come in since her post went live. Many were from people she didn't know, strangers who had been touched by her story. Others were from old friends, people who had distanced themselves from her in the past due to Hannah's influence. The messages were bittersweet, a reminder of how much she had lost, but also how much she had gained. "I'm sorry I let them push me away from you," one message read. "I should have stood by you. I see now how strong you are, and I regret not being there when you needed me most." Margaret sat back, the weight of the words settling over her. She had spent so long in the shadow of her family's shame, but now she was standing in the light, and the world was starting to see her for who she truly was. And as she glanced at the clock, a thought lingered in her mind. The fight wasn't over. There was still more to be done, more to be said. But Margaret was no longer afraid, and nothing would silence her again. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light through the windows of Margaret's living room. She sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of her, her pen moving steadily across the legal documents. There was a sense of finality to the way her hand hovered over the forms, a quiet assurance that this was the last step in a process she had started years ago, long before cancer and estrangement had tangled their way into her life. Her will had been rewritten several times, but today, Margaret felt something different. This time, the control was entirely hers. She wasn't doing this for anyone else anymore. She wasn't worrying about keeping peace or maintaining false appearances. She was taking full control of her legacy, not just the material things, but her voice, her power, her truth. She adjusted the glasses on her nose, reading the final clause of the document one more time. It was the one that mattered most, the one that would ensure Olivia's future was secure, without the toxic strings of her family's influence hanging over her head. "A trust for Olivia Clark shall be established, ensuring her financial and emotional support through the pursuit of her passions. All assets previously allocated to family members shall be redirected to this trust, ensuring Olivia's independence from any future family disputes." Margaret's fingers lingered over the words. Olivia, her granddaughter, the one bright spot in a dark family history. The only person who had never failed her. The only one who had truly seen her, understood her, and loved her without reservation. With a final deliberate stroke of the pen, Margaret signed the document, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her bones. She wasn't just leaving money behind. She was giving Olivia the one thing Margaret herself had never truly had: freedom. The freedom to live without the suffocating weight of family expectations. The freedom to choose her path, free from manipulation, betrayal, or the quiet cruelty that had marked Margaret's own life. The front door creaked open, and Ruth stepped in, her face lighting up when she saw Margaret at the table, her work complete. She didn't ask questions, knowing exactly what had been happening. Margaret smiled, a weight lifted from her shoulders. It's done. Ruth nodded, moving to pour herself a glass of wine. You've made it clear. This is your legacy, Margaret. And it's a legacy of strength, of clarity, of taking control. Margaret raised her glass in a quiet toast. And it's one Olivia will inherit. I hope she can have what I never could. Peace. Real peace. The phone on the counter buzzed, snapping Margaret out of her thoughts. She picked it up slowly, feeling a flutter of unease. It was an email from James. Mom, I know I've been distant, and I should have been there for you. I've thought about everything, and I regret not standing up for you. I'm sorry for letting Hannah manipulate me and for letting things go this far. I want to make things right. Margaret stared at the email, the familiar pang of longing in her chest. She had wanted this. She had longed for this apology, for acknowledgement, for the son she once knew to come back to her, to understand all that she had sacrificed for their family. But now, as she read his words, something had shifted. It wasn't enough anymore. His words were empty, no different from the many apologies he had made in the past, ones that had never been followed by real change. She took a deep breath, typing her response with deliberate final strokes. James, words mean nothing now. Actions do. And I've seen no actions. I've given too much of myself for too long. I've been the one trying to fix things, but I won't do that anymore. I am done. Please respect my decision. She stared at the screen for a long moment before hitting send. It was cold, but it was the truth. It was time to stop pretending that his empty apologies could change anything. The message sat there for a moment, simple, stark, and final. There was no hope left for the man he had been, or the mother she had once been to him. It was a painful truth, but it was the last one she had to face. As if on cue, another notification flashed on her phone. This one was from Olivia. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. Grandma, I got in. The art program, they accepted me. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it. And I'm going to make you proud. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek. She was proud. Proud of Olivia. Proud of the woman she was becoming. And proud of herself. Olivia had always been the light in the darkness, the one person who never looked away, who never doubted her. Margaret put the phone down and went to the small box on the shelf, pulling out the folder with Olivia's tuition paperwork. With a small sigh, she wrote the check, ensuring that Olivia's future would never be threatened by the dysfunctional weight of their family's brokenness. She sealed the envelope, the decision clear, the legacy set. Olivia would have the life Margaret had always dreamed of for herself, the freedom to choose, to succeed, and to live without regret. As Margaret finished her wine, she looked up at Ruth, her heart at peace. Olivia's future is secured. I've done everything I can. Ruth nodded, lifting her glass. And you've done it all on your terms, Margaret. Your legacy is yours to define. Margaret raised her glass to that, and for the first time in years she felt no hesitation, no second-guessing. Her path was set. Her future, and Olivia's, was bright. The rest no longer mattered. And as Margaret sat back, content and free, she knew the final chapter of her story was just beginning. Margaret had just settled into her favorite armchair by the window, a cup of tea warming her hands, when she heard the knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock that rattled the house. It wasn't urgent, nor was it frantic. It was a knock that felt too familiar, like the hesitant tap of someone who knows they've crossed a line but doesn't yet know how to repair it. She didn't need to ask who it was. When she opened the door, James stood there, alone. His face was drawn, his posture slumped as if carrying more than just the weight of the moment. He looked older, tired even, his eyes searching hers for something he couldn't quite name. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with a mix of regret and uncertainty. "Can we talk?" Margaret didn't step aside. She didn't invite him in. She simply stood there in the doorway, the chill of the evening air slipping past them. She met his eyes but didn't speak, letting the silence stretch between them. He started, then stopped. He looked away, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. I messed up, Mom. I should have stood up for you. I should have said something sooner, done something sooner. I let Hannah manipulate me, and I let you down. I'm sorry. Margaret stood there, still. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. There was no rush to forgive, no instinct to pull him into an embrace, as she might have once done. She had already forgiven him. Years ago. She had forgiven him for the silences, for the way he never stepped in when Hannah's cruelty came, for the way he allowed her to be pushed aside as though she didn't matter. But forgiveness, she had learned, didn't heal the wounds. Action did. Do you think an apology fixes everything? Margaret asked quietly. Her voice, though steady, had a coolness that startled her. She hadn't planned on speaking like this, but something had shifted in her. Something in his face, in his words, didn't touch her the way it once would have. James flinched, his eyes flicking to the ground for a brief moment before meeting hers again. I know I can't change the past, but I want to fix it. I want to make things right. Margaret considered his words, and for the first time she felt no desire to tell him that it was okay, that she understood, that he could fix it. Because, in her heart, she knew there was nothing to fix. The damage was too deep, the cracks too wide to ever be repaired with words. No, James, she replied, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. It's not about fixing it. It's about trust. She took a step back from the door, crossing her arms. You stood by and watched it happen. You chose silence. And silence, my son, speaks louder than any words ever could. James opened his mouth to speak, but Margaret held up her hand to stop him. She wasn't done. Words are easy. Apologies are easy. But actions? Actions speak the truth. And your actions, or lack of them, taught me everything I needed to know. You failed me, and you failed your daughter. You failed when it mattered most. There was a long pause. James stood frozen in the doorway, his shoulders sagging, the weight of his inaction sinking in. Margaret couldn't tell if he understood, but he should have by now. I gave you every chance to show up, Margaret continued, her eyes locked on his, unyielding. But you never did. And now, there's nothing left to fix. The door's closed, James. It's not because I don't love you. It's because you didn't choose me when it mattered. His expression faltered. He stepped forward, as if to close the space between them, but Margaret didn't move. She stayed rooted, watching him, waiting for the final realization to hit. I don't need an apology anymore, she said, her voice growing steady once more. What I needed was for you to be the man I raised you to be. But you were silent. And in your silence, you betrayed me. James's face crumpled for a moment, the weight of everything he had failed to say, everything he had failed to do, finally catching up to him. He started, but the words were lost. Margaret didn't wait for him to finish. I'm not angry anymore, James. I've let the anger go, she said, her voice softening but still firm. But remember this next time someone laughs when you should speak. Because silence is a choice, just as much as action is. James swallowed, his face a mixture of guilt and regret. He opened his mouth again as if he wanted to say something else, something more, but no words came. Margaret stared at him, her heart heavy but resolute. You've had your chance to make things right, James. And you didn't. She turned away then, stepping back into the house and leaving the door ajar. She didn't ask him to follow. She didn't wait for him to say anything more. There was nothing left to say. As she walked toward the kitchen, she heard his footsteps behind her, but she didn't turn around. She knew he was leaving, and this time it didn't hurt the way it once would have. This time, Margaret knew the door had closed. For good. Her gaze lingered on the window, the evening light fading into the dark. She had no regrets. She had no more time for empty promises, for silences that cut deeper than any words. She had walked through the fire, and she had come out stronger. The rest of her life, Olivia's future, would be built on her terms. And nothing, not even her son's hollow apology, could change that now. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a new legal pad before her. The ink of her pen, steady and deliberate, moved across the paper as she composed her obituary. It was a strange thing to think about, writing one's own obituary. Most people didn't do it until they had to. But for Margaret, the task felt oddly empowering. She had rewritten so much of her life in the past few years. Her family, her health, her legacy. Each chapter had been shaped by choices she had made, not by the demands of others. Her hand paused over the paper as she carefully crafted the words. Margaret Clark, beloved grandmother, friend, and advocate, passed away peacefully on date. She is survived by her granddaughter, Olivia Clark, who was the light of her life and her greatest joy. She took a deep breath. There was no mention of James, of Hannah, or of the toxic dynamics that had so long clouded her life. Those people had been erased from her story, and it felt freeing. Olivia, the one person who had never wavered, was the only one left. She would be the one to carry Margaret's legacy forward, and that was how it should be. With a final flourish of her pen, Margaret wrote, "In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to a trust for women who have endured family estrangement and cancer recovery, in memory of the strength of those who find themselves rebuilding from the ashes." The words were perfect. They spoke of survival, of breaking the cycle, and of embracing the future, even in the face of the past. As Margaret set down her pen, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was ready to leave behind everything that no longer served her, her past, her broken family, the pieces of herself that had been hidden for far too long. Later that week, Margaret found herself packing up the last remnants of her old home, the one she had shared with her late husband, the one where so many memories of love and loss had been stored. It wasn't that the house had been a prison, but there were too many ghosts in the walls. Too many years spent pretending to be someone she wasn't. As she folded her clothes into boxes, she glanced out the window. The world outside seemed full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret was excited about what lay ahead. She had purchased a small, brighter home in a quiet neighborhood, a place where she could start anew, without the weight of family expectations or the suffocating grip of old memories. The moving truck had just left when Olivia arrived, her face glowing with excitement and a touch of nervousness. She held a small, crinkled envelope in her hand. "Grandma," Olivia said, her voice soft but resolute. I wanted to give you this." Margaret took the envelope, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside, there was a handwritten letter. The words were familiar. But the message, something Olivia had written for her, was a gift Margaret would never forget. "You broke the cycle, and you're my future." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. Olivia had understood her journey, had seen her strength even when Margaret couldn't see it herself. In those simple words, Margaret found the closure she had been seeking her whole life. The cycle of silence, of acceptance, of brokenness. It was over. Olivia was her future. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Natalie, a fellow cancer survivor who had become one of Margaret's closest friends during treatment. "You ready for the brunch?" Natalie asked. her face warm with the same comforting smile that had supported Margaret through the worst of her cancer battle. "The women are waiting for you." Margaret smiled, wiping away a tear, her hand resting on the letter from Olivia. "I think I am. Let's go." They arrived at the cozy little cafe where the survivors' brunch was being held, a place full of laughter and stories of survival, strength, and healing. The room was filled with familiar faces, some she knew from support groups, others who had reached out after reading her blog. Today, she wasn't just a survivor. Today, she was an advocate, a beacon for others who had lived through the same things, the same betrayals, and the same silences. As Margaret stood to speak, she felt a calmness settle in her chest. She wasn't nervous anymore. She had walked through fire, and now, she was ready to share her story with others. She stood tall in front of the group, the quiet energy of the room amplifying her voice. "This journey, the one I've taken, hasn't been easy," Margaret began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "It's taken me years to understand the power of silence and how we must break free from it. For so long, I thought I was doing the right thing by staying quiet, by trying to keep the peace. But the truth is, silence is not peace. Silence is compliance. And it was only when I found my voice, when I finally spoke my truth, that I began to heal." The room was silent as Margaret spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She saw the faces of women in the audience nodding, their eyes filled with understanding. Margaret paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "I've spent so much of my life trying to fix things that were never meant to be fixed. But here's the thing. Sometimes the only thing we need to fix is ourselves. And when we do that, everything changes. We can break the cycle. We can create the future we deserve." She finished her speech to a room that was no longer silent. A woman in the back began to cry, and soon, the tears were shared by others in the room. Margaret felt a deep, unspoken connection with each of them. They understood. They had all faced the same battles, the same silences, and now they were speaking out, together. As the event wound down, Margaret found herself surrounded by women who offered their thanks, their stories, and their support. But it was Olivia's embrace that meant the most. Her granddaughter's words, "You broke the cycle, and you're my future," rang in Margaret's ears. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt that she had truly broken free. And in that freedom, she found her purpose. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Cancer Treatment Center, casting soft rays across the polished floors. Margaret stood before a small plaque, her heart fluttering with a mixture of pride and humility. It had been a long road to get here, to this very moment. The plaque, bearing her name, was a symbol of everything she had fought for. Every hour spent raising funds, every connection forged, every story shared. Her name was now etched into this place, a reminder of her strength, her resilience, and the woman she had become. As she traced the engraved letters with her fingers, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction. This center had been her vision, her contribution, the place where survivors would receive not just treatment, but compassion, support, and hope. It was more than a legacy of her name. It was a legacy of healing for those who needed it most. The door behind her creaked open, and she turned to see Olivia entering, a soft smile on her face. In her arms, she carried a portfolio, its edges worn from use, but its contents priceless. Margaret's heart warmed. Olivia had become the center of her world, the one person who had never let her down, the one person who had seen her, really seen her, through it all. Olivia stepped toward her, handing over the portfolio. "I wanted you to see this," she said, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "I've been working on a new collection. For you." Margaret took the portfolio from Olivia, carefully opening it. Inside were sketches, paintings, and drawings, each piece a window into Olivia's soul. Her use of color, the raw emotion in her lines, the depth of her work. It was breathtaking. Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. Her granddaughter's talent had always been there, but now it had grown into something more, something that could change the world. "These are beautiful, Olivia," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've grown so much." Olivia smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've learned from the best." Margaret's heart swelled with pride as she gazed at the art, but more than that, she felt the weight of the years, of the sacrifices, the battles, and the moments when she had questioned whether her journey was worth it. But looking at Olivia, she knew it had been. Later that evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her journal open before her. She had spent so many years writing for others, for her family, for anyone who would listen. But now, the words flowed freely, no longer needing to be shaped or polished. She wrote the words she had been carrying in her heart for so long. "You are what I leave behind, not them." The sentence was simple, but it spoke volumes. Margaret had given so much of herself to people who had never valued her. But now, Olivia, her granddaughter, her legacy, was the one who would carry forward what truly mattered. She wasn't bound by the past. She wasn't carrying the weight of her mother's cruelty or her father's silence. Olivia had her own story to tell, her own path to walk. And Margaret was proud to be a part of it. The doorbell rang, and Margaret stood, stretching her arms above her head. The quiet comfort of her new life, her peaceful life, was something she cherished. But she had one more piece of business to attend to. It was Diana, her estate attorney, standing at the door with a thick binder in her hands. Margaret smiled and invited her in. "You're looking well, Margaret," Diana said, taking a seat at the table. She placed the binder in front of Margaret, its edges neatly squared. "This is it. Everything's in place. Your legacy is finalized." Margaret opened the binder, the papers inside crisp and clean. The final documents, the will, the trust for Olivia, the instructions for the future of the charity, were all there, ready to be put into action. Diana had been with her through every step of the journey, and now they were at the finish line. "I've read through everything," Diana continued. "It's all set. There's nothing more to do except move forward." Margaret nodded, feeling a deep sense of completion. She didn't need to worry about the future anymore. Olivia was taken care of. The charity was thriving. She had done everything she could, and now it was time to live. Diana raised her glass, her eyes meeting Margaret's with a quiet understanding. "To your legacy, Margaret. To the peace you've created for yourself and for Olivia." Margaret raised her own glass, the weight of her journey finally lifting. "To the future," she said softly. The two women clinked their glasses, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. Margaret sat back in her chair, allowing herself to relax, to feel the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing her life, her choices, had been her own. She had lived for so long in the shadow of her family's expectations, but now she was free. The soft glow of the kitchen light cast long shadows on the walls as Margaret reflected on everything she had survived. Her journey had been difficult, but it had also been hers, and in the end, it was the only story that mattered. As she sat there, surrounded by the things she had built, Margaret knew the future was bright. It wasn't just her future, it was Olivia's. And that, more than anything, was what she had fought for. And for the first time in her life, she was at peace with what came next. The campus was alive with the bustle of students and parents, the air crisp with the energy of new beginnings. Margaret stood at the back of the crowd, her eyes scanning the rows of eager faces, but her gaze was fixed on Olivia. Her granddaughter, radiant and poised, was sitting in the front row, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She looked so grown up, so sure of herself, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a wave of pride wash over her. This was it, the moment she had fought for. Olivia, standing at the threshold of her future, free from the shackles of a family that had never truly supported her. Margaret had given everything for this moment, and now, here it was, unfolding before her eyes. As the orientation speaker began their address, Margaret felt the familiar presence of Ruth beside her. Ruth's arm brushed against hers as they sat together, a quiet but reassuring connection. Margaret's hand rested gently on Ruth's shoulder, and Ruth turned to her, offering a knowing smile. The years of shared history, of challenges met and overcome, had built a bond that Margaret never thought she would find in this lifetime. Ruth had been her constant, her rock, when the world had been too heavy to bear. The speaker's voice echoed across the courtyard, words about opportunity, growth, and the endless possibilities that awaited. Then, the speaker paused, and Margaret's heart skipped a beat as the words they spoke next resonated deeply with her own journey. Sometimes your bloodline ends with betrayal, but your legacy begins with love. The words hung in the air like a gift, a reminder of everything Margaret had endured and everything she had built. She felt her chest tighten as a wave of emotion swept through her, but she blinked it away. She wasn't here to dwell in the past. She was here for Olivia, and for the future they would build together. Margaret's eyes found Olivia's again. The young woman's lips curved into a faint smile, a silent acknowledgement that she understood the depth of those words, that she understood the strength it had taken to get here. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek but quickly wiped it away. This was not sadness. This was pride. This was the culmination of everything. The ceremony ended, and the parents and students began to disperse into smaller groups. Margaret lingered for a moment, watching as Olivia spoke with some of her new classmates, her confidence radiating. Ruth squeezed Margaret's hand, a silent invitation to leave the crowd behind. They walked together through the campus, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the path. Margaret felt a deep, satisfying peace settle over her as they made their way toward the parking lot. The world felt quieter now, as if the noise of the past was fading away, replaced by the simple joy of seeing Olivia embark on this next chapter of her life. By the time they reached Margaret's new home, the sky had turned soft with the hues of sunset. The porch lights were on, and the warmth of the light spilling from the windows made the house feel like a haven, a place where she could finally be herself, free from the weight of her old life. Margaret paused at the foot of the porch steps, her gaze lifting to the sky. The stars were starting to appear, small but steady, twinkling with the promise of a future that had yet to be written. She stepped up to the door, unlocking it with a sense of finality. As she entered, she felt the quiet embrace of the space that had become hers. There was no bitterness here, no anger, just peace. She placed her final legal folder on the kitchen counter, the one containing the last of the paperwork for Olivia's trust and the final details of her estate, the last ties to the life she had left behind. She poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth of it soothing in the quiet, empty kitchen. Margaret sat down at the table, her hands wrapped around the cup as she gazed out the window. The sound of the kettle's final hiss seemed to echo in the silence of the house. She picked up her journal, her eyes drifting to the last entry she had written. I survived twice. The words felt true now, more than ever. She had survived the betrayal of those she loved, the silence of years spent in the background, the sickness that had threatened to take her. And now, she had emerged stronger, free from the ghosts of the past. She closed the journal slowly, setting it aside, before turning her attention back to the warm glow of the porch light outside. The house was small, but it was hers, and it was enough. Margaret smiled faintly as she stood up. her heart light, her spirit unburdened. The life she had chosen was hers, and it was a life built on love, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that she had broken the cycle. As she closed the door behind her and stood at the foot of the stairs, the final line of her story seemed to echo in her mind. When I was banned from Christmas, my daughter-in-law thought she'd won, but I healed in peace they'll never touch. And with that, Margaret took the first step into her new life, a life defined by her own terms, a life where the future was hers to shape, free from the shadows of the past.